Good afternoon and welcome to our continued study of the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. Today we are in 2nd Samuel chapters 12 and 13. If you want to have your Bible open to that, that would be certainly very helpful as we study together. I have a special announcement to share today for this as we present this lesson. And the information for our congregation is here on the screen if you need to contact us or get further information. But we're also pleased that as of Sunday, this Sunday, we're going to be beginning in-person services again at 10:30. There'll be just the one service at 10:30, and we certainly encourage you, if you've just now discovered us, want to come and see us. We'll be having some precautions, and those are the typical ones that are required today for most anywhere that we go, but we're going to try to have a great service together and also be sure we keep one another healthy at the same time. So we wanted you to know that. As we continue in our study of 2 Samuel, we remember that last week was something of a turning point in David's life. He had started out in a wonderful way as king. God had blessed him. He had been very true to God, very noble in many causes. But last week, he committed both the sin of adultery and the sin of murder, and covering up the things that were going on, committing other sins in the process. So as you see the schedule here, the outline for the book of 2 Samuel, today we'll be talking about the troubles in David's house, the things that took place literally within his own family as a result of the sin that he had committed in adultery with Bathsheba and seeing that Uriah the Hittite was killed in battle. So that's what will be in chapters 12 and 13 as we look at it today. The first thing that we see is a normal, natural going forth of what had happened last week. And that is Nathan confronts David about his sin because David, by all indications, had done nothing about this sin. No doubt would have been realizing it, but apparently was able to put it out of his mind until Nathan came to him and talked to him about it. Now, Nathan here in chapter 12 is going to present what is called a judicial parable. And it's a parable in which you can see what's meant by the various figures in the parable, but when you're finished with it, you suddenly realize that you were judging yourself because it's about you. And so that is what happens to David as Nathan shares his parable with him. We're going to look a little more closely at this particular set of verses than we are the latter ones in this chapter and the next chapter, because it is so much a part of the changes that took place in David's life. Then the Lord sent Nathan to David, and he came to him and said to him, there were two men in one city, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had exceedingly many flocks and herds. But the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb, which he had bought and nourished, and it grew up together with him and with his children. It ate of his own food and drank from his own cup and lay in his bosom, and it was like a daughter to him. And so we see here two people contrasted, a rich man who had everything, or the poor man who had one special little lamb that's, as so many times the case today with pets, had become a part of the family and was much loved. He was not simply another animal, but he was a family pet. As the parable continues, a traveler came to the rich man who refused to take from his own flock and from his own herd to prepare one for the wayfaring man who had come to him. We can immediately see that the rich man had a terrible attitude, taking from someone who only had one of something, and while he had plenty, the one he might have taken from his own flock would not have been missed. And so it's natural that when you hear a story like this, you're going to think there should be some retribution. This is not right. There should be some justice. And indeed, that's what David realized even though it wasn't until a little bit later that he understood that Nathan was talking about him. So David's anger was greatly aroused against the man. And he said to Nathan, "As the Lord lives, the man who has done this shall surely die. And he shall restore fourfold for the lamb because he did this thing and because he had no pity." So the conclusion is very clear. What happened was wrong. It's just that David doesn't understand that Nathan is talking about him, whereas he had everything as king of Israel, was blessed. He had wives, he had riches, he had power. He had come to have peace within the nation. Everything was going his way. And now he takes from Uriah the Hittite the one thing that was his, the most valuable thing, and takes it for himself. So David doesn't realize this until David directly points it out. Sometimes it's amazing how people can not see themselves until someone else points it out for them. That seems to be what happened in King David's case. Then Nathan said to David, "You are the man. Thus says the Lord God of Israel." We're going to omit some verses there as far as reading them. But we see Nathan pointing out to David this person in this parable was no less callous than you were. And in fact, because human life was involved, it was even a fact that David was more callous than the man in this story. You are the man. And then Nathan goes on to explain to David what's going to happen because of that. He's not making this up for himself. He's telling him what God had told Nathan to tell David, and it was not a very good future. Nathan says, "The sword is never going to depart from your house because of this." He said, "Adversity from within your own house will come upon you." And indeed, that's going to happen in just a few verses. And he says, "A neighbor will take away your wives. They will be his wives, and this will be done in a public way, in such a way as the people of Israel would see it. And it would be very clear to them what had been done." So that is going to be David's punishment because of his sin with Bathsheba and his role in taking the life of Uriah the Hittite. At this point, David seems to very clearly recognize his sin and to recognize the need for repentance. So David said to Nathan, "I have sinned against the Lord." And Nathan said to David, "The Lord also has put away your sin. You shall not die. However, because by this deed you have given great occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme, the child also who is born to you shall surely die." So Nathan gives David the promise. It's not going to be a matter of taking your life because of this sin. However, you're going to have to pay for it because it's a public thing. People are going to know this, and it's going to bring shame on the Lord. It's because of what you did. And it was literally a matter of causing blasphemy upon those who were just looking for some reason to speak poorly about the Lord. And he said very clearly that the child that was born to you in Bathsheba is going to die. All of that was going to be a punishment because of David's sin. The next thing that we see here, chapter 12 continues, is the death of David's son, just as Nathan had said it was going to be. Then Nathan departed to his house, and the Lord struck the child that Uriah's wife bore to David, and it became ill. And then we see David in a state of repentance, a state of grieving, a state when he was lying on the floor and praying to God, would not take any kind of nourishment, even though his servants tried to get him to eat, to take care of himself, as sometimes is done when people are grieving like that. He refused that. And he constantly prayed to God that this child might be spared. And the text says that on the seventh day it came to pass that the child died. And the servants of David were afraid to tell him that the child was dead. They recognized the anguish which David was feeling just with the thought that the child was so sick that he was going to die. And they did not want to tell him that the child actually had died, fearing what he might do when that might be the case. But David hears them whispering among themselves, no doubt debating who was going to tell David, how they were going to tell him, and when they were going to tell him. And he asked them, because he understands this is probably a sign of what has happened. And he said, is the child dead? And they said to him, yes, the child is dead. So David proceeds to do something that surprises the servants, so much so that they actually verbalize what they don't understand about what's going on. They say David gets up and he straightens himself up. He takes nourishment. He begins to get back into the regular activities of life, and they don't understand that. And they say, we don't understand why the child was sick. You were going through all this, and now the child has died, and you've gotten almost back to normal. And David says to them, while the child was alive, I fasted and wept. For I said, who can tell whether the Lord will be gracious to me that the child may live? So David's thinking was, yes, Nathan had said God is going to take this child away from them. However, he knew he served a gracious God. He knew, no doubt, that praying to God was powerful, and he was true in his repentance. And so he was hoping for a different outcome because of his prayer and his grieving and his dependence on the grace of God, which in this case, unfortunately, was not to be. So he tells his servants, there was hope then. I held some hope. Maybe the child would be spared. God would be gracious and change what he had said through Nathan was going to happen. He says, but now that he is dead, why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I shall go to him, but he shall not return to me. So David recognizes that God has spoken. God's will is finished in this case. There's not going to be a sparing of the child's life. And so now he realizes that the prayer and fasting and pleading for the child's life is not going to do any good. And he explains that to his servants. And so he and Bathsheba, no doubt, are grieving over the child that they lost. But after the loss of that child, there's going to be a point at which David and Bathsheba go on, and there's going to be another child born to him and to her that's going to be a cause of some rejoicing. It's going to help perhaps put the grief behind them in the case of the previous death. We see here that shortly after these events, Solomon is born, and he's going to bring joy to their house. Then David comforted Bathsheba, his wife, and went into her and lay with her. So she bore a son, and he called his name Solomon. Now the Lord loved him, and he sent word by the hand of Nathan the prophet. So he called his name Jedediah because of the Lord. So we have two names given here. David, before Nathan comes, and Bathsheba present to this boy child the name Solomon, a name which means peaceable. And certainly, compared to some of the violent things that took place in David's life and under his reign, Solomon had a more peaceable time during his reign, at least in some ways. However, Nathan brings this other name, Jedediah. Jedediah means beloved of Jehovah. So most who have commented on this verse seem to believe that that was somewhat God's way of saying, I approve of this child. The text says he loved him, and it's God's way of saying this is a child of my approval. And of course, this was going to be a child of David's approval too, because of all David's sons, all of David's children. This was going to be the one who was going to be assuming the throne after David's death. So this child is born, and it's a cause of relief and a little bit of easing of the grief, no doubt, from their previous loss. Now we remember that before all of these terrible things started with Uriah the Hittite and the sin with Bathsheba, that the army of Israel was in the country of the Ammonites, and they were being led by Joab, the commander of David's army, and they were besieging a city by the name of Rabbah. And so the text tells us about this time in the course of events that Rabbah is going to be captured by Israel. Apparently, it was a lengthy battle. They perhaps waited them out, surrounded the city, and eventually the city was forced to surrender. But now it has been at least on the verge of being captured. And the text says, now Joab fought against Rabbah of the people of Ammon and took the royal city. So it was basically a victory. It was Joab's victory. However, Joab does something that no doubt would keep him in favor with David. It's something that was really rather humble, probably not unusual for those who served their king in those days loyally and wanted their king's approval. But he sends word to David and says, David, basically we've taken it. What we'd like for you and some more of Israel to come over here now. So people won't be saying, yeah, Joab took that city. They'll be saying, look what David has done through his power and his authority, so that David would get the credit, the honor for the victory. So it turns out that Rabbah was a city with a great deal of spoil. There was a very special crown that was worn by the king there, and that crown came to belong to David. Of course, he was the king. He was the one getting the credit for this. And the people of Ammon were forced to do labor. It was a forced labor situation for the Israelites, and they were conquered by them. So another victory for David and his army. Now, unfortunately, we go back to the situations in which there is conflict and tragedy among David's family, that which Nathan had predicted. Because even though David was not going to die, he was certainly going to suffer by the things that were going to happen within his own family. And we have the terrible tragedy that involves Amnon and Tamar. Now, to appreciate this, we need to get a picture of the participants in the story that's laid out for us in the next few verses. We see here somewhat of a chart of the house of David, both going back before him and after him. And we see two of the sons that he had, Amnon and Absalom. We also see over here another green circle representing that, or pointing that out, Tamar, who is a full sister to Absalom, but only a half sister to Amnon. So they were all related, but Absalom and Tamar had the same parents through David and his wife. David had another wife who was the mother of Amnon. So this is the genealogical setting for what's about to take place. After the events we've read about here, Absalom, the son of David, had a lovely sister whose name was Tamar. Remember Absalom, Tamar, full brother and sister. And Amnon, who was a half-brother to her, the son of David, loved her. Amnon was so distressed over his sister Tamar that he became sick, for she was a virgin, and it was improper for Amnon to do anything to her. So basically, we say that Amnon understood that Tamar was beyond his reach. She was off limits, and there should be no relationship between them. However, the text says he was sick over that, perhaps psychologically, perhaps physical symptoms as well, but he was sick because he wanted something he could not have, which of course is a very sad commentary on him. So while Amnon is having trouble going through day by day and not wanting to eat and looking like he's not doing well physically, he has a cousin who is would also be David's nephew. And this cousin is described as a shrewd or a crafty man in the text. His name is Jonadab. And Jonadab says to Amnon, why are you doing this? Why are you acting like this? You're a son of the king. You need to get what you want. And so he said, here's what you do. You go to your area, your home, your place in the home, and act like you're sick. And then when your father comes to check on you, you say, I could be well, but I need Tamar to make me some food and bring it to me. And then I would feel better. So that's exactly what happened. David asked Tamar to take food to Amnon to help him not be sick anymore. As far as we know, there's Tamar would have had no knowledge of this. Certainly, she had no consent in this. She had no active participation. She was the victim here completely, and perhaps did not know anything when she took the food to Amnon to help him get well. She was simply helping a half brother, a member of the family. So when she comes, Amnon has all the servants sent away, and then he tries to force himself upon Tamar. And at first, it's simply a matter of him saying yes and her saying no. But then afterwards, after a period of time, he does force himself on her and sexually assaults her. And interestingly, the text says after this, instead of longing after her and loving her, thinking she was beautiful, that Amnon actually hated her and told her to go away, and actually told the servant to sort of shove her out the door and bar the door behind her. He didn't want to see her anymore. It was time for her to leave. And that's exactly what happened. And of course, Tamar was weeping over this. She was grieving. She was weeping in a way that was visible. And somewhere along the way, Absalom, who was her full brother, recognized this. He figured out what had happened, and he tries to comfort her. But all the time that he's comforting her and trying to help her get over this horrible thing, he is no doubt in the back of his mind planning for some sort of revenge, because we see that will come just a little bit later. We also read that David was very angry that Amnon had done this. It was wrong. David knew it was wrong. But at no time, the text tells us, did David approach Amnon and talk to him or do anything about this terrible thing that he had done. However, Absalom did not forget. And we don't have to read much further until we find out that Absalom kills or has his brother Amnon killed. Verse 23, it came to pass after 2 full years that Absalom had sheep shears in Baal Hazor, which is near Ephraim. So this was some distance from Jerusalem, and the work was being done there. And perhaps under the guise of being a celebration, Absalom asked David, "Can we have everybody come out and kind of celebrate there?" Perhaps it was the end of sheep shearing. They had a good year and things were going well, and then time to celebrate. But David was not willing or able to come. However, all the other king's sons did. So Absalom invited all the king's sons, including Amnon, which David at first questioned, but he allows it, even though he certainly should have been suspicious based on previous events. So all of the king's sons go there, and Absalom has a plan in mind from the very start. Absalom had commanded his servants, saying, "Watch now, when Amnon's heart is merry with wine, and when I say to you, strike Amnon, then kill him." So we have an assassination here that was planned well ahead of time. Absalom sets this up because of the hatred that he still feels toward his half-brother for the sexual assault of his full sister. And so that does happen. The text tells us that all of the other king's sons, perhaps fearing for their lives, certainly not wanting to be around this situation, get on their mules and they head back to Jerusalem, no doubt as quickly as they can. Well, the message gets back to David before the king's sons do, and the message is that all of his sons have been killed. And we don't know the details of that message. We don't know why that an incorrect message was sent. Was it misunderstanding? Was it part of some sort of scheme? Anyway, that's the message that got to King David before the king's sons did, for him to see them and see that they were alive. So he tore his clothes and he laid upon the ground and he began to grieve, just as he'd done before, because of what he thought was the truth. But then he learns from Jonadab. We remember Jonadab. We'll talk about him more in just a moment. Jonadab tells him, no, it's not all your sons. It's simply Amnon. And it's because Absalom wants Amnon dead because of what he did to Tamar. And so you've only lost the one son. Your other sons are okay. And eventually those other sons do come riding back to Jerusalem, and he sees them and certainly relieved because of that. However, there's still tragedy there. And we think about Jonadab. Remember, he's the cousin of Amnon. He's the one who put the plot in his head that led to the assault upon Tamar. And now he's the one trying to apparently ease the severity of what's going on here, because he would assume that David would be much less grieved over losing one son than losing all of his sons. So perhaps he was involved in this in some way as a scheme. The text doesn't say that, so we don't know. But certainly he was there at the right time to sort of smooth things out just a little bit, and perhaps trying to help out his cousin Absalom once again. And so David is encouraged, at least, that it is not all of his sons who are dead. Now, Absalom no doubt realizes that it would not be wise for him to immediately go back to Jerusalem. He's going to have to flee for a while. He's going to have to get away, let things calm down, and perhaps the anger of his father and the attitudes of others would be calmed a little bit over a period of time. And so he does leave the area. Absalom flees to a place called Geshur. Now, Geshur was on the east side of the Jordan River. It was up immediately to the east, as you see on this map here, immediately to the east of the Sea of Galilee. The province of Galilee would have been, or the area that's known as Galilee during Jesus' time particularly, would have been over to the west side of that. He goes and he stays there because of what he has done and because of the punishment that he would expect to receive if he immediately goes back to Jerusalem because of what he's done. And so he flees there. Absalom fled and went to Geshur and was there 3 years. And King David longed to go to Absalom, for he had been comforted concerning Amnon because he was dead. So David has mourned. The other sons come back, and yet there's mourning. There's tearing the robes and laying on the ground and all the other parts of the grieving process that was part of their culture back then. But eventually David does recover to some extent. And he realizes, yes, I've lost a son, but I've also lost another son because he's so far away and I don't see him. And even though that son had done something terrible to another son, the text says David longed to go to Absalom. He longed to have him there with him, to love him once again, to see that he was okay. But Absalom stays there for a period of 3 years. And if you're familiar with the rest of 2 Samuel, we recognize that when Absalom does return, it's not going to be just a happy family reunion, and the division between Absalom and his father is going to grow greater and greater, even to the point of open rebellion. And even through all of that, it's sort of a remarkable thing that David still loves Absalom right up to the very end as a son, in spite of all the things that he has done. So thank you for being with us for our study of this portion of 2 Samuel. Next week, Lord willing, we'll continue on from there, beginning in chapter 14, and we'll see more trouble that comes to David, both within his own house, within his family, and also as far as his reigning as the king over Israel. And just as Nathan had stated, as he brought God's will to David, there was going to be a great deal of tragedy as he went ahead. And all of that, of course, was unnecessary, but came about because of David's tremendous sin. So, again, if you'd like to see other lessons that we have on our website, see other materials, you just want to ask questions, learn more about us, perhaps considering visiting with us, here's the information that you can look at, and please feel free to contact us at any time that you might want to. Thank you.